Welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan Watson. I'm the assistant professor in nematology at Louisiana State University Agricultural Center. And today I'm going to be talking about scouting for nematode problems. So this is just a bit of a outline of my presentation today. We're going to start with a bit of a crash course in nematology. Then we're going to transition over to discussing how various plant parasitic nematodes have evolved to feed on the crops that we produce. We'll then do a bit of a slideshow of crop damage that's caused by nematodes, ones that I've observed in my travels in Florida and Louisiana. And then we're going to be talking about how to scout for particular damaging nematode species, so things like the root knot nematode, the soybean cysts nematode, the reniform nematode. And we'll even discuss a little bit on how to scout for some of these other nematodes that we can find in production fields. So on my slide here, the picture on the top left, we're seeing some nematode damage caused by the root knot nematode on caladiums that were produced on raised plastic beds down in South Florida. On the right, top right, we see ring nematode, both the juvenile on the left and the adult female on the right. Bottom right, we see nematode damage caused by the root knot nematode on zucchini down in Florida. And left is the same plant before it was uprooted. So seeing quite a bit of damage. So this is my crash course in nematology. So what are nematodes? Well, nematodes are semi-microscopic roundworms that inhabit many different ecosystems on Earth, not just in our soil, but they're in our streams, they're in our lakes, they're in our oceans. And not all nematodes feed on plants. That's really what I want to emphasize here. Some nematodes feed solely on bacteria. So we can tell what a nematode feeds on just based on the mouth structure morphology. So as we see in the photo here, bacterial feeding nematodes have this large barrel-shaped cavity in their mouth for just engulfing bacteria. Fungal feeding nematodes, they have this structure called a stylet. It's like a hypodermic-like needle that they use to puncture into fungal hyphae and feed on the nutrients or on the cell contents. We have plant parasitic nematodes. They have a very similar structure. It's also called a stylet, but it's a little more developed, and that's because it needs to get through plant cell walls. So it's a little harder to get into there and feed. We also have nematodes that feed on other nematodes. That's what we call a predatory nematode. And you can see a photo of one on the bottom right in this slide. And then we have nematodes that feed on all sorts of different food groups. So we call these omnivorous nematodes. And the point I want to emphasize here is that some nematodes that inhabit the soil are beneficial to ecosystem function. So we're not out there to try to kill every nematode in the soil. It's specifically the plant parasitic nematodes that we're after. So this next slide shows a diagram of the soil food web. Why I wanted to show this is to emphasize which are our targets in agricultural production systems and which nematodes are actually beneficial and why. So if we start with the first trophic level, that would be our plants, capturing the sun's energy and atmospheric CO2 and binding it to organic, tissues, basically, so plant tissues. We have things that feed on that. That would be the second trophic level. So that's where our plant parasitic nematodes would fall. But we also have nematodes that feed on all the different fungi and the bacteria in soil, and they are very important for soil ecosystem function. They essentially liberate nutrients that are bound in our microbial biomass and liberate them for use by plants. We even have nematodes that feed on other nematodes. That'd be up at our fourth trophic level. And this creates this top-down regulatory force on the entire soil food web and kind of keeps any of these individual components from kind of getting out of hand, such as our plant parasitic nematodes. Okay, so this is about nematology and agricultural production systems. So now we're going to focus on how plant parasitic nematodes feed on crops. And there are three main approaches. The first one that I want to discuss is ectoparasites. These are nematodes that feed on plants from outside of the root system. They use that stylet, that feeding structure, to puncture into roots, but they basically just latch onto the outside and then feed within the cells on the interior of the roots. And we can see a photo of that in the top right here. It's more of a diagram. And the level of root damage varies by the nematode species, the density that it's at, and the host crop. For instance, the sting nematode, Balonolimus longicaudatus, causes severe root stunting, even at very low population densities. Whereas the spiral nematode, Helicotylanchus species, only causes minor root stunting. Other thing I want to emphasize is a lot of these ectoparasites, they may not be that damaging directly due to their feeding, but they might be damaging because they vector other issues, such as plant viruses. An example of that would be the dagger nematode, Ziphionema species. We also have what are called endoparasites. These are nematodes that feed on plants from within the root system. And this category can be further subdivided into two different types: migratory endoparasites. So these are nematodes that continue to travel within the roots as they feed. They cause formation of necrotic lesions in the root system, which predisposes the roots to infection by secondary soil-borne pathogens. An example of a nematode that would follow this sort of feeding would be the lesion nematode, Pretolenchus species. So that's what we see in the top right here. That's a lesion nematode. Middle photograph, we are seeing a lesion nematode that's embedded into the root tissue and migrating around as it feeds. And bottom right, we're seeing some necrotic root tissue as a result of the nematode feeding. We also have sedentary endoparasites. So these establish a permanent feeding site. They do not continue to move around as they feed. So this involves an intricate relationship between plant hosts and the nematode parasite. Examples of that would be the root knot nematode, Molitagon species, which we will be talking about in quite a bit more detail today, and the soybean cyst nematode, Heterodera-glycines. And that's what we see in our photos here. Top right is soybean cyst nematode. So these are soybean roots. The little white things on the roots, those are the soybean cyst nematode. Bottom right, we're seeing carrots that have been galled up by the root knot nematode. What do I mean by galled up? Basically knots in the root system. That's where this nematode gets its name. And of course, we have the in-betweens, the semi-endoparasites. So they're head regions inside the roots, but the tail region remains outside the roots. Examples of this would be reniform nematode, Rhodolenculus reniformis, and things like the citrus nematode, Tylanculus semipenetrans. So the photo on the top right, we're seeing some unstained mature reniform nematodes that have gone after this particular cotton root. Bottom right, we are seeing a stained nematode inside the root. So you can see how the anterior portion of the nematode is embedded into the root tissue, posterior end is hanging outside the root tissue. And on the photograph on the bottom left, we can see at the top of the photograph the mature females, on the bottom the egg masses that they're producing. So that's where the eggs get laid and completes the life cycle. Okay, damage caused by nematodes. In general, plant parasitic nematodes cause a generalized stunting of plant growth. It's quite difficult to actually diagnose that it is a nematode issue. So we'll see signs of nutrient deficiency, early yellowing. This is because the plants cannot actively, or I should say effectively, uptake nutrients when they're parasitized by nematodes. And it's the same with signs of drought stress, early wilting. The plants just cannot uptake water when they're parasitized by nematodes at a high degree. In severe cases, severe nematode infestations, it can even result in plant death. Now, nematodes are often distributed in a patchy distribution within a field, and that's one of the characteristics, key signs of nematodes. Hotspots is what we like to call them. So basically, areas in the field that are showing severely stunted growth. And we can see some examples of that in the photos here. So the top right, this is a cornfield, relatively close, not long after planting, where we're seeing early stunting of the plants. When we went out there and we pulled soil samples from within this stunted patch, there were a lot of root knot nematode juveniles. If we pulled soil samples from outside that patch of stunted growth in the healthy portion that we see in the distance, really weren't a lot of the root knot nematode juveniles. And it's the same in the photo on the bottom right. Here is cotton in Louisiana that is being parasitized by the root knot nematodes. We see a lot of skips, a lot of plants that did die early on after planting. So now we're going to go through just a bit of a slideshow of damage. So here is damage caused by the reniform nematode. This is a cotton field in Louisiana. It might be kind of hard to see, but if you look closely, you can start to see some chlorosis, some yellowing in certain patches of the field, but it's pretty widespread, and that's quite typical for the reniform nematode. We don't always see those distinct patches of hotspots of stunted growth with reniform. When we take a closer look at the plants, we see leaf chlorosis, yellowing of the edges, and that's because the plants just cannot take up the nutrients that are in the soil because they're so heavily parasitized by the nematode. This next photo shows a soybean field in Louisiana that is being damaged by the root knot nematode. In this case, it's the southern root knot nematode, Meloticon incognita. And in this case, with soybean, a lot of times if the nematode infestation is severe, we'll actually get plant death right in the middle of those hotspots. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So we're seeing basically a spot within the field with a whole bunch of dead plants. And if you look to the outer edges, yellowing, leaf chlorosis, and it even looks like the problem is maybe spreading throughout the field. We see other little patches of yellow in there. A telltale sign that we probably have a root knot nematode issue. And sure enough, when we sampled, we did. And I wouldn't say you can do this always, but sometimes you can scout for root knot nematode damage after your soybean crop's been desiccated. So this was an example from Louisiana where after a really heavy windstorm, all the soybean plants in the middle of that hotspot had been blown down. When we went out into the field and pulled roots, essentially pulled plants out of the middle of that hotspot, well, we see it on the bottom right here, the plants from the middle essentially had no root systems. That's why they blew over. If we pulled plants from the outer edges of this hotspot, we saw a significant root galling on the soybean plants. And then if we were to go outside of this hotspot, out in the distance and pull plants, we still saw some galling, but not nearly as much. Now we're going to transition a little bit over into vegetable production down in Florida, very severely impacted by nematodes often. So on the left here, we're seeing root knot nematode damage on a cucurbit crop down in South Florida. So you can see just this patch of really stunted plants, and they actually went back in and reseeded it. And I doubt those little seedlings are going to make it. On the right, we're seeing damage on a cucumber crop in Central Florida caused by the root knot nematode. This is Meloticon javanica, a different species, the Javanese root knot nematode. What we see is there's some skips out there, definitely some stunting of the plant, some leaf chlorosis. And when we pull up the root systems from these plants, they show severe root galling. Essentially the root system is just one giant gall. So it makes sense. These plants aren't going to be able to take up much water and nutrients with that level of galling. Here is a tomato field in Central Florida that is being parasitized by the root knot nematode as well, Meloticon javanica, Javanese root knot nematode. So this is at a research station at the University of Florida. And on the left here, we have a row in this raised bed that was fumigated with telone 2. So a broad spectrum soil fumigant that takes care of nematodes and a lot of your other soil-borne issues. And then on the right, we're seeing an untreated row. And it's like night and day. The plants on the left that grew in fumigated soil are looking pretty healthy. Plants on the right, not so much. We really didn't yield anything out of the untreated soil. So it just goes to show the level of damage that root knot nematode can cause on tomatoes and other vegetable crops. And just wanted to wrap up with an ectoparasite, damage caused by an ectoparasite, and one particularly damaging ectoparasite, the sting nematode, Bolonolimus longicaudatus. So this is a strawberry field in Central Florida with a severe infestation. And in the photo, you can see this giant patch of stunted plants, very small plants. They show signs of nutrient deficiency. We'll see some purpling of the outer leaves, very low yield. And when you pull up the plants, the root systems are quite severely stunted. And it even looks like this problem seems to be spreading throughout the field. If you look into the distance, there's another hotspot out there. Okay. So how do we scout for root knot nematode, Meloticon species? Root knot nematode are typically causing severe stunting in patches in the field, those characteristic nematode hotspots that we get. The root knot nematode will go after most of the cultivated crops that we produce. But the thing to keep in mind if you're out there scouting for this pest is that we have developed resistant varieties for this nematode on a lot of different crops. For instance, cotton, soybean, the list goes on and on, sweet potato. So keep that in mind when you're out looking for this pest. Has the farmer planted a susceptible variety or cultivar or not? The other thing to keep in mind is that this particular nematode often causes much more severe symptoms in sandy soils. So that's really where you should target your sampling and scouting efforts, the sandy portions of the field. So how do you scout for this? Well, typically, go out to the field, look for a hotspot, and uproot the plants. This nematode causes very specific and distinct symptoms. So it's that root galling, the knots in the root system. So we see a photo of that on the top right here. And here in the middle photo, that's a closer up view under a microscope. You can see the gall, and then attached to that gall is an egg mass. So if you were to burrow into that gall, you'd find a mature female in there that's just laying eggs in this egg mass, completing the life cycle. Now, the thing to keep in mind if you're scouting for root knot nematode, you typically are going to need to wait about 20 to 30 days after planting your crop to see any signs of root galling. So don't go out there 2 weeks after planting and expect to see this. And other thing to keep in mind is that these symptoms are going to get more severe as the crop cycle progresses. So as you get further on into the season, you're going to see a lot more galling if you're in a infested field. And that level of galling, the root galling severity, is an indication of the level of infestation. So if you're out scouting in a field and you pull up a plant and you only see one gall, it's probably not a really bad root knot nematode infestation. If you go out there and you see something like our image here on the top right, completely galled up root system, you have a severe infestation and probably needs to be managed. Other thing I want to emphasize with the root knot nematode is that it's still beneficial to pull soil samples to check for juveniles, maybe when the crop isn't in the ground. So in early spring before planting or in fall after harvest. By doing that, we can see if there are juveniles in the soil and based on the density, determine whether you're likely to see crop damage or not. So send samples, soil samples, particularly to a diagnostic lab for diagnosis. Scouting for the soybean cyst nematode, heterodieroglycines. Above ground symptoms aren't always present. We don't always see those very distinct hotspots that we get with the root knot nematode, but sometimes we do. So if you do see those out there, that would be the place to start sampling and looking for this pest. The good thing about the soybean cyst nematode is that it has a minimum host range. Really, the only major crop that it's going to be going after is soybean. So how do we scout for this pest? We'll pull up roots from the soil very carefully, of course. Use a shovel. Don't just go yanking the roots out of the ground because you're likely to lose a lot of the root tissue and perhaps a lot of the cysts or galls if it's the root knot nematode. You'll leave roots behind. Pull up the plants, check the roots on these soybean fields, ideally, mid-season, June to August, kind of in the middle of the summer, and check them. See if they have any visible cysts attached to the roots. The dark cysts, these are the dead female soybean cyst nematodes. They're often associated with the older roots, and they can be kind of difficult to see in a field setting, particularly if the roots are still covered in soil. The white cysts, these are the females that are associated with the younger roots, and they're easier to spot when you're in a field setting. And we see a photo of that in the top right. Here's a soybean root with a whole bunch of soybean cysts attached to it. How do we scout for the reniform nematode? This one's pretty tricky, that partly because it doesn't cause any obvious root symptomology. Other thing is it can be pretty widespread within a field. We saw a photograph of that earlier. So it's not always going to be in those hot spots. This nematode has a moderate host range. So things like corn, grain sorghum, they're actually non-hosts for this pest, and they're used in rotation to help manage the reniform nematode population densities. But this is a major pest on cotton, soybean, sweet potato, particularly in the southeastern United States. And as I say, it is very difficult to scout for this particular nematode in a field. Sometimes you can see sand particles adhering to the egg masses on roots, but by no means is that a definitive diagnosis. So typically you're going to need to collect soil samples and send them to a diagnostic lab for accurate diagnosis of this particular nematode species. Photo on the top right, we can see some reniform nematodes that have been stained in tissue. On the bottom right, we can see the egg masses and kind of looks like there's a little bit of sand attached to them. That's kind of what I was getting at, and that you can kind of look for this nematode out in a field, but it will not be a definitive diagnosis. And lastly, how do we scout for other nematode problems? There's a vast array of plant-parasitic nematodes that go after the crops that we produce here in the United States. The key is going to be collecting soil samples and sending the samples to a diagnostic lab. It's often the best way to diagnose most of the nematode problems in our field crops. Ectoparasites, they often don't produce any obvious root symptomology. I mean, we might get stunting of the roots or stubby looking roots, but it's hard to specifically say that's due to this nematode pest. Furthermore, above ground symptoms almost always look like nutrient deficiencies and drought stress. So the key to accurately diagnose and scout for other nematode species is to collect good soil samples and send them to a diagnostic lab. So my advice is to follow your state's diagnostic lab guidelines for soil sampling and keep an eye out for any nematode issues when you're out in the field. With that, thank you for your attention and have a great field season. Thank you.